Stephen, thanks for coming on. I really appreciate you taking the time to have a conversation with me. Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself before we get started?
Well, I'm a professor of philosophy at Rockford University in Illinois, just outside Chicago. I've been here for a long time, except for some sabbaticals and leaves where I've been visiting professor and so on at other places. I love philosophy. I love intellectual history, and I'm hoping, appreciative of the invitation, that we'll be able to focus on those things profitably.
Awesome. So what are your interests recently? I've heard you've been focusing on like philosophy, the foundation of ethics and philosophy in education. Is that something?
Yes. My two best known books are on intellectual history, on explaining postmodernism and the influence of Nietzsche on the Nazis. But yes, I am working in philosophy of education primarily this summer, finishing up a manuscript there. And there, the idea is, everyone kind of agrees that education is a mess, not only politically, but intellectually, pedagogically. So some of the reasons for that, of course, are political and so on, but I'm looking more at the wide variety of philosophies that gets translated into ideologies that then get injected into the schools, and that creates for not only kind of an inconsistent mess, but everybody's upset with all of the ideologies that they disagree with being foisted on their children from their perspective. So trying to sort that out, but from a philosophy perspective.
Yeah, I was actually recently talking with a person who's a philosophy of esotericism, and he was doing the research and history of occultism and mysticism, and something that's really not been taken seriously in academia, but to me it seems about as legitimate as the philosophy of religion. And so it's interesting how we select particular topics of education to go into curriculum and ignore others, even though they might have the same kind of influence on our philosophy.
Yeah, well, sure, but so in that case, with respect to religion, as a nation, we made a decision that we're going to have government-provided education, and for the most part, the Western world has been increasingly secular, and so that has meant less religious education, but also formally, particularly in the United States, there's a separation of church and state, and that means drawing a very tight box around when and how religion can be included in the curriculum. So yeah, that certainly is one big set of issues.
So what do you think are the most foundational core things of how we decide what goes into the philosophy of education and what doesn't?
Well, I don't know that there's any one foundation, and there's no one thing that we agree upon. I think that's part of the issue. What we're doing when we are educating, and that's broader than schooling. Schooling is one institutional vehicle for doing education. We're raising the question primarily about taking a child and raising the child to adulthood. So we recognize it's a long process. The child is, has certain capacities and needs, but is undeveloped in significant ways. So we really are talking about a 12 to 15 or 20-year project. And when you start to think of that project on that scale, then necessarily philosophy comes into it, because then you're saying, okay, what kind of life am I preparing my child for? What kind of world is he or she going to be entering into? What capacities need to be developed? How much of this is done by the child himself or herself? How much of it is done by parents, teachers, and so on? When we send the child out into the world, what are the core values that we want the child to be able to pursue? Love, career, recreation, enjoying art, and so on. So necessarily it becomes a very philosophical project. You're in effect answering the question, what is the meaning of life? Because that's what you are preparing the child for, your conception of a meaningful life. And parents and teachers who take that seriously become philosophical very quickly. But then philosophy is hard, philosophy is complicated, and it's just a big mess with, in my view, about 8 major philosophies on the scene right now, but depending on how you carve things up, a dozen or many dozens of them. So then to come to your question, what is the foundation? What is the most important thing that children need to learn? And are they going to learn it themselves, or is it something that we are going to teach them? And that's where all of the disagreements are. So to come back to your question of religion, for example, one of the foundational things is going to be, some people will say, well, look, the real world, that's what we need to prepare students for. They need to know how to look after their bodies, to train their minds kind of rationally and scientifically so they can get a job, so that they can have healthy romantic relationships and friendships and enjoy the world. Now, if that's your foundation, your understanding of the real world, and then what's going to follow from that foundation is a certain set of values and a certain set of skills that you want the children to learn. By contrast, if your foundation is to say, no, the most important thing is that there is a God, and God has decided what your purpose is and what you are supposed to do, then that's going to lead to a very different idea about what the proper values are to instill in your child. So right off the bat, it's going to be very different. Another foundational issue is going to be, do you take the child as an individual, as a human being with his or her own mind, and that it's important that he or she understand things for himself or herself, dream big dreams, and that you're trying to foster and support the development of that individual child. So when he or she is ready to leave the nest, she can go out and pursue happiness as conceived by that individual. But that is, of course, hotly contested by those who have a much more social understanding of the human being. You're not an individual. You're an aspect of society, or you're a fragment, or you're born into a certain place and you have various obligations, and it's not about your happiness, it's about your fulfilling those obligations and submerging your individuality into certain sorts of groups. And we want to create someone who's going to be a good citizen, or a good servant of the state, or a good representative of our racial, ethnic group, and so on. So again, those foundations are hotly contested and take us in very different directions.
What do you think are the current paradigms in our current education system? Because to me, it seems like in Christian schools, you obviously have the religious aspect, but it seems like what we are focusing on teaching kids in America specifically is more how to be a good worker bee, learn lots of rote facts and information, learn how to be able to do repetitive work over and over again, essentially just making them into good employees, essentially, without actually giving them much sense of value or much sense of how to function in the world. Like, we don't teach them how to do their taxes, how to raise a kid, none of the things that seem like it would be pertinent to how to function in life as an adult, mostly just things that seem to make you able to become a good employee.
Yeah, I would say that conception is accurate, a little bit dated, but still one of the major ones that are operative. And certainly, as we got into the 20th century, that idea about what education is, to create good worker bees, in the factories, in middle management, and so on, recognizing some people are going to be artists and some are going to be visionary entrepreneurs, but that's not really what education was designed for. And partly it was, I think, as you suggest, driven by economic needs. We want to have a powerful economy, and that means we need to have millions and millions of people as well. I think partly, though, it was not only driven by economic considerations. A big part of the push for the transformation of education in the early part of the 20th century, and we still are doing things largely the same way, the rationale for it was political. We want citizens in a democracy. Democracy means that people see themselves as part of a core group with the same general set of political values, the same understanding of their history. And so there was a kind of top-down standardization of civics education. I think another part of it was partly driven by politics, partly driven by a kind of managerial, bureaucratic ethos that's not necessarily economic, not necessarily political. Just, we need to standardize everything, we need to manage everything, and there's certain top-down understand it. And then, more importantly, we need to be able to measure everything. And so if you're trying to measure outcomes in education, it's a very difficult process. But if that's your goal, then that means you want to standardize things as much as possible. You want everybody to be doing the same thing in the same way and have very easily operationalizable outcomes that you can then measure. and then you can put those in the reports to whomever you want to put in the reports. You want to have a standard number that employers can easily read. Right? The person had a 3.4 GPA, and that means something across the board. Right? Or that person has been certified and in civics education and now is qualified to vote, and we can reliably turn over political decisions to that person as well. So a number of forces, I think, came together to drive that model of education that you outlined. Not the only one, though, and it has hot competition from any number of anti-systematic, anti-worker bee, anti-civics education philosophies of education, and they are widespread also in the curriculum.
Awesome. Do you have other examples of other countries that use these other ideologies? Like, do most countries use the same thing, or are there examples like Finland or Japan who have different foundational goals with their education system?
Well, yeah, as you start to then scale out internationally, you will find lots of them. For some, the economic criterion is absolutely important, and so they will build their education system around that. So if you mention a country like Finland, for example, it made a strategic decision a while ago, that it's small, its population is small, it has some natural resources, but it's not going to be a natural resources giant in any broad sense. It doesn't happen to be sitting on huge lakes of oil that can finance whatever. So it decided it's going to focus on training intellectual capital, so that Finland's, for example, value added to the world economy can be technical people who can enter into technical fields, computers, and so on, and be successful in that sense. As you go out internationally, a nation like Russia, since the fall of the Soviet Union, has prioritized a certain kind of political education, building national unity, a certain model of historical education, and a certain political filtering of international understandings to build up a political consciousness that is then useful. Obviously, in some parts of the world, traditional religious educations, if I'm thinking more broadly speaking about Islam, which is multinational, and for them it's not economics that's prior, it's not political, it's a religious consciousness, and that involves a certain status of women, and they recognize very well that they are going to take economic hits if they keep half of their population women relatively undereducated, but they are willing to do so because of their ultimate religious mission and so on. So yes, then you get into a wide variety of models.
You mentioned how hard it is to try to compare different systems without some kind of like standardized testing system. Is there a way to assess which of these models and focuses have been more successful overall at building up a successful economy?
Yeah. I see. Right at the very end, you added the criterion. I think the first part of that. How do you do all these cross comparisons? You can't do that unless you agree what your outcome is that you are, excuse me, trying to measure. So, if your goal is to have an economy that is successful, then that makes it a lot easier. So then you can just go take all the economies, rank, gather all of the data on their economic performance, and then correlate the economic performance with the education. Now, I think this gets very interesting very quickly. So you then would say the largest economy in the world is the United States. And then you can scale out. The largest economies per capita have been the Western European nations, Japan, Australia, and so on. And then you can correlate that with, they are broadly market-friendly types of economies. And so then you can try to correlate that to education systems, but there I think it breaks down. So in a country like the United States, it is the largest economy, and in part it's the largest economy because consistently it has been the most innovative economy. Other economies that have been moderately successful have been largely close follower economies. They don't develop all of the new technologies, but they're very good at, once a new technology comes along, taking that technology, perfecting it, and improving it at the margins and so on. So What we then have in the United States, for example, and now we're narrowing down, is an extraordinarily entrepreneurial economy. And that's the reason why it's been so economically successful. So then you would say the best economy is going to be the one that has a society or a culture that generates lots and lots of entrepreneurial people, has a healthy entrepreneurial culture, and that's the United States. Now, here is where I think there's a breakdown to any sort of a correlation with education systems, because the American public school education system is not set up to produce entrepreneurs. It is set up to produce worker bee types of people who have perhaps basic literacy, basic historic knowledge, and so on. So it will populate corporations and businesses with all sorts of people who can keep the corporation running. Well, what is fascinating then is when you look at all of the people who are the entrepreneurial drivers of the economy, almost none of them learned what they needed to learn, became the kind of entrepreneurial people that they are because of their public school education. Instead, almost all of them will say, I hated school. I skipped school a lot. I didn't read anything. I was the rebel with respect to school. I dropped out in high school, or I dropped out in university. And then I went on to do this great entrepreneurial thing. So, all of the famous examples, Bill Gates and Steve Jobs, and there are dozens of them and hundreds of them once you start to look. So what you then have is an interesting puzzle that the United States has a highly entrepreneurial culture, but it has that despite this more authoritarian, one-size-fits-all, worker bee regimented form of public school education. So I think then what we have to say is the explanation is what American culture does outside of school, outside of formal education. It's still very good at generating lots of innovative entrepreneurial people. But that's aside from the question that you were asking.
Yeah, for sure. So what do you think? Do you think it's important to add that? Is that something that the education system in America is missing? Would benefit to add that? Or does the fact that it's added from these external sources make it more successful than if it was a part of education?
Yeah. No, I think it is part of education, but it's not part of schooling. So let me just push on that distinction right now. I think so if we just focus on American education, I think American education is very good. That young people have access to lots and lots of things, generally supportive parents, generally a certain amount of freedom, lots of technological resources. They learn a huge amount from all the video games that they play, all of the movies and TV shows that they watch. They learn a huge amount from each other in all of these social media applications that a large number of people want to derive. But those are absolutely important self-education vehicles as well. We have a culture in which huge numbers of students learn musical instruments. What's fascinating, this is actually a very good example, but I'll come right back to that one. Huge numbers of sports opportunities where they learn, about self-discipline and personal achievement and teamwork and leadership and so on. But a lot of that, the vast majority of the healthy stuff, happens outside of school. Now, what's interesting, I would say that we don't need to add that to the schools. What to do with the schools, we'll need to come back to that right now. But to come back to that music example, I think it's very revealing that by nature, every human being in the world loves music. We just naturally love music, and we seek out music, and we pursue all kinds of music, and we develop our tastes. And we see someone who can play an instrument, a significant minority of us want to start playing that instrument, and we copy and so on. And we have an extraordinarily amazing musical culture, all of the different genres of music that are constantly being created, and so on. So none of that came out of the schools. Right? None of that came from people saying music is really important, and so we should add music to the curriculum, and we're going to hire music teachers to teach music. And of course, that has happened to a certain extent, but then almost everybody hates music class in school. They love music, but they hate music education as it is done. Right? And you can't find a single major musician who said, you know, what happened was I started taking music classes in my public school at age 6 and so on, and I went through the formal system and I came out this awesome, innovative musician. Never happens. Instead, all of the great musicians, all of the composers, all of the performers, they acquired their education outside of the schools. And that is a fascinating realization, but I think it's also an indictment of the way schooling is done, that you can take something that people naturally love to do, and then, given the way that you are teaching it, turn it into something that people hate and avoid. Right? So what I would then say, to answer your question, is that we don't need, in some sense, to add music education to the schools or any sort of innovative entrepreneurial education to the schools. What we need to do is either shut down the vast majority of those schools and start over, or bring in entrepreneurial, innovative people and let them reform significantly the schools from the inside.
What would that look like? You mentioned what we would need to do to improve the schools, to tear it down and rebuild it and let innovators reshape it. What do you think that would look like in practice?
Yeah, I think that that's too hard for me to say. I mean, I've got my ideas, but I think it would be the same thing, as if we were talking about any other kind of product or service. What we need to do is have that entrepreneurial culture in which there are going to be 100 or 800 different experiments that are done. And the people who are doing the experiments have the freedom to try those experiments and the freedom to evaluate how the experiments are going, and then the freedom to be able to change and try something different when the experiment is not working. So the most important innovation is going to be not the specific experiments that are done, but having that culture of entrepreneurism, experimentalism, and innovation inside the mainstream schools. If you don't have that, then of course people will try to graft on this or that reform, but it will just get chewed up by the bureaucracy, and nothing is going to happen.
Yeah, it seems to be a big problem in reforming education, is that our system doesn't like experimenting, especially on kids. It's seems very negative, even though we know trial and error and evolution are some of the most successful models that we've ever created. But the bureaucracy says that we're not allowed to experiment on different kids or different schools. They almost have the same equal education. How do you think we try to overcome that barrier to be able to experiment with different kinds of education systems?
Well, partly it's going to be an intellectual, and partly it's going to be an institutional overcoming. I mean, part of the problem, in a way, this is the easier problem, is recognizing the institutional barriers. Right now, you have an institution, there are people who have jobs, many of them are unionized, many of them have political bureaucracies that are attached to them. And to put it bluntly, there's no way in hell that you are ever going to convince those people, let's be experimental and innovative, right, and so on. That's just not in their institutional DNA. They will fight tooth and nail. So the only solutions to then are to say that we are happy with, and this is not the one that I'm going to be advocating, we're happy with having a C-level education system that's highly bureaucratized, and maybe the kids will learn some things, but that's just the way it is. We're not going to change the status quo, right? Or you are going to disempower the bureaucracies and you're going to disempower the unions. I think people will recognize that that's what has to happen inside the public schools, but so it's intellectually easy to recognize that that's the problem. But how you do that politically, that's a problem for political activists to accomplish. But I think the more serious problem is going to be the intellectual problem, because if you want to have entrepreneurism and innovation and experimentalism and so on, what that requires is that parents have a certain attitude with respect to their kids, and that teachers have certain attitudes with respect to their kids, and anybody who is in cultural leadership perspective with respect to children to have that same attitude. And there immediately you'll find some parents who will be, I'm fine with free range kids. I'm perfectly happy, just letting my children try a whole bunch of things and letting them choose what sports and musical activities and so on they're going to watch. and facilitate that, and then work with them on the things that they show interest in. And they can explore their neighborhoods and ride their bikes and so on. So many parents are in that camp, but of course many parents are not in that camp right from the get-go. Those parents have a very firm idea. Sometimes it's religious, sometimes it's political, sometimes it's careerist. My kid is going to be a lawyer, right? Or my kid is going to be a doctor. And they're not at all interested in children making their own choices and exploring. It's rather a top-down agenda is applied to the kids by the parents, and so everything is going to be scripted that way through. So parents' philosophical education in that entrepreneurial direction, that is what has to happen. But that's there's millions and millions of new parents every year. Those are the ones who are going to be doing more than anybody else deciding the education climate for their children. So and then again, we're right back into all of the philosophical issues.
Are there examples of education systems like that, with like the free range kids example? And are there examples of teachers and institutions that do adopt that?
There are lots of them. In a way, for all that we bemoan the state of public school education and then more education more broadly, in the last 10 years, I would say there never has been a more experimental time with respect to education, just because so many millions of people recognize the failings and outright disasters of mainstream schooling. So there is a huge unschooling movement that's out there. Now, these are all people who are very strongly committed to education, but what they believe is that schools as an institution is not the right method of having children be educated. And so they're going to be going in a more free-range kids. Lenore Skenazy labeled that movement beautifully in varying degrees. So there are, in that sense, thousands and thousands of experiments that are already going on. There are other models of education that are institutional, and they have well worked out systems in place. So here, the most prominent one is the Montessori method of education. There's an entire philosophy of education that's worked out, and now over a century of institutional practice with some experimenting that goes on. But that is very child-centered, very much focused on developing the child's autonomy within a structured range of choices and competent parental and teacher supervision and facilitation. So a lot of that is going on. And then, of course, there are just hundreds and hundreds of new types of schools that are being started right now by education entrepreneurs, some of them traditional bricks and mortar institutions. And then, of course, we're all aware of I've lost track of how many new online schooling systems are being tried. And there's a huge amount of experimentalism, and some of them do explicitly put entrepreneurism, innovation at the core of their discipline. Another I think positive development is the large number of schools and unschools that are rehabilitating rather the notion of play and the importance of play to education. And here I recommend Peter Gray, who's a kind of an educational psychologist. He wrote a book called Free to Learn, and I highly recommend that one. But he is one of several people who are taking this notion of play to say, if we look at children naturally and almost any animal species at their infant play, the distinction between work and play is not really an operative distinction there, right? And to the most part, most of us want children just to play for the first years of school, and that they learn a huge amount from playing, right? You plunk a kid down in the sandbox and give them a bunch of toys, and they get endlessly creative. And you put two kids in at the same time, and they start making up rules and projects and experimenting, and that's not working, let's try this, and so on. And I can remember my kids, then you just add a garden hose turned on low, and it suddenly becomes amazing civil engineering lessons that are going on in your backyard sandbox. So, and they're just playing. But that's a very different attitude, toward if I said, all right, now we are going to learn about the principles of water hydraulics and and materials science. That would put a very different frame upon it. And then also all of the lessons that are coming out of developmental psychology and the after the fact kind of reverse engineering of people we know who have been successful in all walks of life, in the sciences, in business, in the arts, in music, and so on. You know, the Albert Einsteins and Steve Jobses and thousands of other people. And all of them, almost all of them without exception, will say, work to me, learning to me is not work in that stereotypical sense. I'm just playing, I'm just having fun. And there are just things that I became interested in when I was a kid. And maybe I had to fight my parents and fight my teachers in order to carve out this play space for me to get my real education. Or I was fortunate to have teachers and parents and mentors who just let me play. And on the basis of that, I became, this highly accomplished kind of person. So that again then comes back to your earlier question. We're not so much focusing from the lens of entrepreneurism or innovation. If we then say, look, life should be fun. It should be about the pursuit of happiness. It should be about, in that deep sense, having a good time, and kind of recognizing that the love of play is built into us psychologically and biologically, and build then our education system around the concept of play. Rather than this is the serious business and you need to stop playing and pay attention, and education is a kind of obligatory duty, then I think we will have a huge reform that's in place. So one particular vehicle of that I find promising is just the video game, which was largely derided in the first 20 years or so. But there's now, interesting, a large number of studies. If you are interested in people learning things, look at what actually happens in a lot of the sophisticated video games. Your children learn role playing, and they build all of these maps. I need to go here, there, and the other thing. And they learn the experimentalism because, I tried this 17 times, but the bad guy killed me and I had to go back 3 levels. And so they develop their skills and their eye-hand coordination and their memory and their strategic sense. And it's all very fun and playful for them. And they will stick with it for hours and hours and hours and learn enormous amounts of stuff. So can we take all of that gaming stuff and turn history into a game, turn music into a game, turn math into a game? So there's a large number of, I think, very fruitful experiments being done in that area as well.
So how does homeschooling play a part in this system? Is homeschooling a kind of experimentation in the same sense? And why is it so much more successful than the other public schooling models?
Yeah, well, I think homeschooling is more successful. I did overlook that one when I ran through the list as well. And there's been a huge boom in homeschooling. A lot of it, the original homeschooling movements, there were 2 of them. One for religious reasons. People thought religious education was central to their child's education. They're not getting that in public schools, so I'm going to do it. Or this was typically people more on the political left for political education, that they want to train their children to have a certain kind of political ideology. They don't want kind of mainstream civics education that they're getting in the public schooling and so on. So, hippies and strongly religious people then were at the forefront. But then as people realized that the public schools, for the most part, were not delivering, a lot more people started to try homeschooling, and there were a lot other models of homeschooling that were being done, and then networks of homeschoolers. So, maybe I, as a parent, I'm pretty good at math and science, but I don't know anything about poetry and literature. But my neighbor down the street is homeschooling, and she knows literature and poetry very well. So we'll set up a little network thing where I will help her kids out with the science and tech stuff, and she'll help my kids out. And so all of these very successful networks are being developed. Now, why they have been more successful, I've looked at some of the data here. Maybe I just haven't looked at it closely enough. But the data that I have looked at has been promising, but I don't know if the quantity and the quality of the studies is up that we can say some general conclusions. But I think this will be borne out that the explanations for why it's more successful is that you take away a lot of the social crap that goes on in public schools. People say, well, people need to have the socializing, and obviously kids do need the socializing, but the problem with many public schools is that it's bad socializing that kids learn. They learn hostility and to be antisocial, to hate their teachers and to hate half of their fellow classmates and so on. So you take them out of those toxic social environments and you have a home where it's a much more benevolent social environment, and kids are still in their neighborhood and have other kids in the neighborhood, or they go to sports lessons and they get their socializings there. So they're more likely, I think, to get benevolent socializing in homeschooling than in much of mainstream schooling. Also, you have parents who, on average, care about their children a lot more than, on average, teachers care about their children. So I might be a parent with 5 kids, but I love all of my kids. And while that's a lot of work, I am able then to care about and demonstrate my caring for my kids easier than a public school teacher who has 25 or 30 kids in the class, and half of them he or she doesn't like very much. Another third is kind of indifferent to, and then has a few that he or she likes. And then, of course, parents are more willing to spend their own resources, time resources, financial resources on their kids than teachers who, frankly, even very motivated teachers, they watch the clock, and they, it's the rare dedicated teacher who's going to stay for more than an hour or so after class, or spend time on the weekends and drive kids around to soccer lessons and take them to museums, et cetera. So I think homeschooling, if it can be done, is a whole lot better. Another reform I would mention is, and there's another whole set of experiments that are being done that try to combine formal schooling with apprenticeship programs. So the idea that every child needs to go to college, and that we're training children to go to college, and maybe for jobs down the road, instead of recognizing that for a large number of kids, college is probably not the best option for them. It's not that they're not smart enough, it's just that's not where their interests are, that kind of more academic specialist learning. Instead, they want to work with their hands, or they want to get started earning money and seeing the world earlier than that kind of model. So letting children choose their interests, if they have a demonstrated interest at a younger age, 12, 13, or even younger, or a little bit later, and then tailoring their education to give them the kind of schooling courses that are going to help them prep for that. So, another course on Roman history and the Peloponnesian War and how the Egyptians mummified people, that's not really going to help them very much. So we'll have a different kind of history education for them. The guy's a car guy. He just loves cars. Can't wait until he gets his driver's license, is always taking motors apart and so on. Well, let that guy take a history of transportation and focus on that, and have the kid be in school for half of the day, and the other half of the day, actually working with an auto mechanic and rotating into a car factory or an auto supply shop, some sort of apprenticeship that's going to let the kid earn a little bit of money, but then also learn real world skills that his or her formal schooling is supplementing. So I'm encouraged that there are also experiments that are being done in that direction increasingly.
Are those like trade schools? Are those an example of that kind of education?
Yeah, trade schools are going to be an example of that. So, for example, young girls, and this is a stereotype, but there's a lot to the stereotype, because I know some of them in my neighborhood where they turn 13, 14, and they are entirely interested in fashion, and they're entirely interested in makeup and hair, and that is, they're interested in lots of other things, but that's a dominant thing. And so they are going to go into the fashion industry. They are going to become beauticians, and maybe they will start their own shop. So having a beauty school, for example, or a fashion institute, where they can take the history of clothing and learn materials sciences and learn about math and business, and so that they can run their own business and calculate how much fabric they need, and learn applied chemistry so they can learn about all the new hair products and what's going to work and what's safe to put on people's faces and not. So have that formal schooling, but tied in with the trade school that is tailored for them. Yeah, absolutely.
What about some concerns about certain topics which we think are probably not very beneficial for the economy? Something like, what if they get interested in moving rocks or gender studies or something that may not necessarily have a positive impact?
Moving rocks.
Yeah, if they just have a huge interest and they just want to move a rock from point A to point B and back, and that's just
Yeah,
they're like autism. I have autism, and people with autism have a special interest, and sometimes that
right.
special interest is just a completely random event that may not really do anything.
Yeah. Well, then I would think that would require some specialist education there. So if the person genuinely has limited cognitive and affective range, then making sure that you are not putting in that person's education system something that's just outside of their range. And so that's going to be requiring some, parents and teachers who know how to do those sorts of things. But then finding within whatever that range is and making sure that the kid's exposed to as many things as possible within that range, so that they hopefully develop more interest than just the one moving rocks, right, and so on. On the other hand, I would say if the kid really is just interested in moving rocks, that's all they want to do. Well, in construction, we do move rocks around, and there are lots of people who drive backhoes and drive tow trucks for a living. And perhaps that's exactly the job that would be the right kind of job for them. So training them from an early age to become sophisticated rock movers, let them be rock movers at the best possible level, and that might be what's best for them. And then what was the second example you had? Wasn't the rock movers? Gender studies.
Yes.
Yes. Okay, so now we're going to get into push button politics and psychology and biology as well. I'm perfectly fine with kids learning gender studies because I think this is a controversial set of issues for a good reason. Now, when we say gender studies, I don't mean I am only a social activist ideologue and I have one particular view that I have researched for all of 3 days, right, on the internet. That kind of gender studies, and all I am is an activist trying to force my ideology down people's throat. But the relationships between gender and sexuality and the formation of human identity, I think that's a perfectly legitimate subject because society is complicated, and all of the social roles that are sometimes put on human beings instead of being options that human beings can explore. All of the gender psychology and its relationship to my biology is very complicated. And I do want to say that psychology is still an infant science. Biology is more developed, but we are still in the early stages. So I would say gender studies, if that is a vehicle that it's taught as a legitimate enterprise, we're going to learn about genetics and developmental biology and psychology and sociology. And we are going to do the history of all of the different ways males and females and non-standard types of individuals have been dealt with in different cultures across time, and all of the literary explorations of that. And I would say, yeah, absolutely. Kids interested in gender studies, let's do it.
So where are the limits? Like, how much freedom should we give kids? Are there points where we should say direct them away from certain things, or is it pretty much free reign and give them as much freedom as we possibly can in every outlet?
Right. Now, I would say the limits are as the parent, right, and or the teacher, your best understanding of what the child's physical and cognitive and emotional limits are, and all of these things are developmental. So to take kind of an obvious example, if you take an infant who is learning how to crawl, the infant is not yet physically able to manage stairs. That is something that needs to be learned. So before you know that the child has developed his or her physical coordination and strength enough to handle stairs, then one of the limits is you put a gate across the stairs. And you don't just say, oh, just free reign, the kid's got to learn about stairs, right, and so on. Or, obviously, if you take the child out into the woods, If you live in woods where there are some dangerous animals and the child is not yet able to distinguish from the dangerous animals from the animals that are not dangerous, the child does not have that cognitive information yet, then before you leave the child in the woods, you go into the woods with the child and you make sure the child learns the difference between the dangerous animals and the safe animals. Then once you know the child has that cognitive development in place, then free range, the child can go out into the woods himself. And same thing, though, on hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of examples. So what I would say is close with the parents and the teachers with the child as the child is developing physically, cognitively, and development. But as soon as you know that something is within the child's physical, cognitive, or emotional capacity, then the child has autonomy in that area.
So if you were going to start your own school education program experiment, what would be the foundational tenets that you would focus on in modeling that system?
Yes. Well, here I would say first and foremost that if we're starting, say, from infancy, right, I would say kind of focus on two things. One, more on the physical side, that the child has certain physical needs that must be met: warmth, nutrition, and for physical activity. And my job is to, as the parent, while the child is not able to provide those things for himself or herself, to provide them, but then at the same time to teach that child how to do all of those things himself or herself as he's able to do so. So I think, yeah, physical education starts right at that point, but that's the principle. And what I would be doing is just making sure the basics are in place for the child in those areas. And then as the child develops, giving the child more autonomy to be able to do those things for themselves. And the same thing on the psychological side. Children are psychologically very busy right from the beginning. Their senses are very active. They're looking at everything. They're touching everything. Everything goes in the mouth. They're tasting everything, and they're listening right to everything. So all of that sensory development needs to be fostered right from the beginning. And you want to expose the children to all the kinds of things that you as the parent and teacher know they need to be exposed to: human voices, the sounds of a dog barking, and what that means, and the doorbell goes, etc. But then as soon as the child is expressing an interest in any of those things, then working with the child's autonomy to further that development as much as possible. And then higher cognitive development does start pretty soon, as soon as children start to learn words and they start to play around with dada, mama, doggy, and so forth. And so that's a genuine need. And so working with the child's cognitive development intensively when those moments come along. The third part of that, it's more on the psychological side, is the emotional management. So it's not just kind of abstract or sensory cognitive development, but we're also intensively emotional beings, and those emotions do work with our senses. They do work with our cognition. They do work with our physical bodily state. So intensively working with the child to foster a benevolent attitude, or a benevolent atmosphere within which the child can develop, and attending to that emotional atmosphere. So, you know, if the parents are rageaholics, you know, that's a big problem, right? If the child has a need for affection, and children do have need for affection, but they don't get that affection. They do get an emotional starvation. So there's a huge amount of physical biology developmentally that I think parents and teachers need to learn, and they need to be very attentive and customize that to their child. And there's a huge amount of psychological developmental stuff, and we're learning stuff about all of this all of the time that parents need to keep up on and be very attentive to right off the bat. So that's a high-level strategic thing, and the customization, I think, comes from each parent knowing his or her child the child the best. So what I applaud is when I see, you know, sometimes I still go into bookstores But I just love seeing the bookstore section where there's, parenting. And, I'm not in that bookstore section of the bookstore anymore, but I go by it. And I just love seeing young women and young men. Sometimes they are obviously pregnant, sometimes they are not. And they are in that bookstore. And you know what's going on, right? They found out that they are pregnant. And they've taken on this beautiful responsibility, but they're going to get up to speed as much as possible. And so they're going to walk out of that bookstore, with a dozen books, and they intend to read it through. And that project, carries on basically as long as you've got the kids until you are an empty nester.
Are there good education models that are close to what you're advocating for that we can look at to try to emulate?
Yeah, I think up till age 4 or so, I like the free range model. Basically, letting children have free range as much as possible. Lots of alone time, lots of time with their siblings, lots of time with their parents, lots of times developing little friendships. So, but the emphasis there should be on free range as much as possible. There are a number of good systems out there. My favorite, though, is the Montessori system, starting from age 4. And I think that's well worked out in the track record of the Montessori system. I'm not denying that there are other ones that are very good, and but that's the one that I know the best. And that's my go-to first recommendation for kids looking for an alternative kind of school. Although Montessori is pretty much mainstreamed at this point from 4 on through high school age. At that point, I do like very much the apprenticeship program, trade school program, specialty programs for kids who've expressed an interest and some skills in sports or in music. So to speak, at the high school level, definitely, where the child has developed some personal interests and can have a much more specialized education in that way, and that their more academic stuff is tailored to supplement that as well. And even there, though, I do think increasingly the methodology should be more Socratic between parents and children, between teachers and their children at that point. All of the basic stuff in textbooks and the kinds of things that teachers deliver as lectures, all of that the children can get themselves by going online. And there's no reason why there can't be formal lectures at school. Once a week, the teacher's going to give a lecture on Roman history, and students who are interested can come to that. Or teacher's going to give a lecture on heat dynamics, and students can come and attend to that. But most of it should be Socratic, the students doing their own work, their own reading, and then talking about that with someone who's an expert in that area. And then for higher education, that's where I spend most of my time in university. The kind of model I like the best is if you think, say, 3 meetings per week as the standard, the professor will do perhaps one formal lecture, once every 2 weeks on some subject, and a formal lecture done very well can be a very good way of delivering a huge amount of compressed information. That presupposes that the professor is actually good at giving a dynamic, interesting lecture, and not just the kind of terrible lectures most of us have been exposed to. But there, I think the bulk of the time should be Socratic, because as we know, in conversation, you can cover a huge amount of ground. You can find out very quickly what the students know, what they don't know, and drill down on the things especially that they don't know, or see the further implications very quickly. And so I think Socratic education is the best at that level.
Awesome. I know you have to go at 12, so I want to give you a few minutes there. But do you want to give any links or references where people can find more about you and your work if they're interested?
Well, yes, I would say first the CEE video channel. That's at YouTube, and it's an extension of my my university-based research and teaching center. But there we have a huge amount of material focused on education. One of the things we do is we bring in education and other experts, and we interview them, and we put the interviews on the CEE video channel. As well, my philosophy of education course, it's a we've put the whole thing on there with high production values, with accompanying readings and my talking through all of the issues. So if you want something more structured on philosophy of education, that's all at the CEE video channel. And then just my website, stephenhicks.org, is where I post not only on education issues, but everything else that I do in general. So if you just want a generic knowing what I'm up to, stephenhicks.org.
Well, thanks, Stephen. It was great having you on. I really appreciate you taking the time. It was a great conversation.
Yeah, fun topics, fun questions. Thanks a lot, Tom.
Absolutely. I will let you go because I know you have a meeting you have to get to in a few minutes, and I hope you have a
Thanks.
wonderful day.
All right. You too, sir. Bye for now.